So, welcome to British Water's first thought leadership video and podcast. I'm delighted to have Dr Mark Fletcher, the Global Water Leader of Arup. Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, my first question to you is, Arup's strapline is shaping a better world. Now, what does that look like for Arups and for you?
I think from a corporate perspective, that's embedding sustainable development in all we do. From my responsibility perspective, from a water perspective, that's sustainable water management. And it's living and breathing it in every way possible through what we do personally and what we do collectively through our projects. We've embraced the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals as an organisation. We see those as a potential framework within which to bring greater, more positive and sustainable outcomes across the world.
And do you think the UN Sustainable Goals are actually achievable?
I think they're achievable if we can get collective momentum around them. And I think more important than the absolute value is the collective action. And I think that collective action extends way beyond those are national goals, extends to everything we do, seeing the benefit and the synergy of working together.
Well, this sort of leads on to my second question, because obviously the global challenges in water are around population increases, urbanisation, climate change, and all that brings in terms of droughts and more sort of severe weather conditions. What do you think collectively we can be doing as sort of global water supply chain companies to address those challenges?
I think it'd be really important if we start adopt a common language. We talk about the same things from different perspectives. Understanding resilience, not just to climate change, though climate change is the biggest threat to mankind. I think not just looking at this from a company perspective, or as I describe, inside a sort of water slice of a pizza, but looking at it from a systems of systems perspective. We've been looking at resilience from a city scale, but then extending across the entire water cycle, trying to ensure that we think about who's responsible across that water cycle, the governance, and getting greater clarity on who's responsible for which part of the water cycle, get the whole machine working better.
Okay, so who do you think is actually leading the way in this field?
Well, I'd say there's a number of areas where there's good practice we could draw from. Very interesting in China, the work they're doing in sponge cities at the moment. We're looking at master planning in Shanghai and how you can combine grey infrastructure, the sort of large tunnels, pumps, pipes we think about, but with green infrastructure and blue infrastructure. So that's maybe decentralised green space across a city and how that can soak water up, passively treat and provide significant benefit. In New York, as a result of Sandy, an awful lot was done to develop their thinking around what the Americans call resiliency, but it's the same issues. Particularly looking at where you can get corridors through the city in which you'd allow water to run across the surface rather than hiding it away underground, and how that you can put large numbers of what they call bioswales, they're green areas of sidewalk that soak water up and store water. They've put about 7,000 bioswales across New York. So there's an element of scale in what you do.
So it seems like you need really to sort of have governments and different bodies really passionate about the issues. Otherwise nothing's done. And you have to have the funding available to do these sorts of projects.
You do. And I think the funding's really important, but for me, it's about us getting alignment and this common objective. And I think if we can get that, then I think the funding then is one of the enablers, but it's more important that we get alignment. I didn't really talk from a technology perspective. There are countries who are leading the way. Israel have made significant advances in what they do in water technology from having very little. I think the Dutch have done very well in terms of looking at water management, particularly around flood management as well. probably obviously because of the impacts they've got on their country. And Copenhagen, as a result of having its cloudburst, its 1,000-year storm, it's almost like someone sprinkled magic beans, and there's blue-green architects and engineers coming out of Denmark at the moment with fresh ideas and fresh thinking around what you can do within cities.
So I'm going to turn now to the UK market. So what do you expect for the next asset management period, number 7?
I would like to see a lot of direct procurement contracts, because that's an initiative Ofwat have developed to look at different ways of approaching major projects. In reality, I think we'll be building less things. I think we'll be looking at maintaining things better. We'll take a real interest in our asset health, how we can improve that and optimise the systems that we work within. I think customers have got to be right at the heart of any thinking, and I think that the positive regulatory aspects of outcome-based thinking, I think they're going to start to deliver dividends. We just have to ensure all the regulators are aligned around that, and new thinking around how we use catchments is embraced across the board.
Yeah.
So the direct procurement contracts, these are potentially major projects. Thames Tideway is a good example of where that thinking's come from. And I think there's a number of things like, I don't know, a large reservoir in Lincolnshire, or maybe one in the within the Thames area that may gain some traction. And it's how you deal with those separately and get some separate focus. I think Havant Thicket's another reservoir that Portsmouth Water are looking to promote. So that gives us sort of a good example of a direct procurement contract. I think that principle, though, could be taken to other things, maybe to programmes of work, if they're managed in the right way. So it's going to be an interesting AMP to see how innovation is delivered. Yeah. We're talking a lot about innovation. It'd be really good to see it in practice.
Well, as British Water represents companies in the supply chain of the water and wastewater industry, one of the questions I wanted to ask you around direct procurement is, how do we bring the sort of small and medium-sized companies along on that journey? So
I think in the whole procurement process, it's really important that we encourage not the visibility and the value that small and medium enterprises can bring to the table. That may be through alliance contracts, where we've got a number of organisations very much working to a common objective, or it might be through specialist procurement, of direct procurement of certain services, where there's differentiation in the service that's offered by those companies.
I mean, one of the age-old sort of questions that often we're asked, and I'm sure you're asked by small and medium-sized companies, is there is some frustration about getting their innovation adopted or tested and piloted by water companies or whoever.
I agree.
And I don't know what way or what solution we can offer to help SMEs to better showcase what they've got to offer to the industry.
So I think a number of the water companies are looking at this and how they can host and trial different technologies. In Scotland, Scottish Water now have development centres where they've got redundant water treatment works and a redundant wastewater treatment works still connected into the system, where you can try out technologies on both part of the distribution system and the sewers, but also within the treatment process, and that can go back into conventional supply. So there is, I'd really welcome the companies working together a lot more than they are doing. They seem to tickle it a little bit. It'd be really good if we got this collective action and we all knew where all the key test centres are, so that we can accelerate trials of innovation as much as possible.
Well, it seems to be a key sort of Ofwat focus, resilience in around and innovation, but they're also talking a lot about collaboration. So they want the water companies, as you said, to collaborate a lot more and to sort of look at in terms of being social enterprises.
I agree. So there's a challenge there in that there's also competition. Yeah. So for me, whilst there may be competition, it's really important that the big problems and the real big technical challenges, they come together and they mobilise a collective resource in that space. And I think that's what the principle of Water UK and Queer with their 10 big challenges or whatever, what they're trying to do. I just think there's so much more that could be done.
Yeah. Now I'm going to have to mention the B word, Brexit. I mean, how does Arup view Brexit, or what's your personal views?
I think it's a real challenge, and I think regardless of your politics, we just seem to be in some middle ground. Whether we Brexit or whether we remain, it's more important that we collectively get behind what we're doing. Interestingly, in Arup, our Europe region, where we trade the euro, has been separate to the UK for about 10 years. And I think that was really because we were getting exchange rate fluctuations. But it means that there will be challenges in this country if we change our political, if Labour get in and they have nationalisation in the manifesto, it brings a lot of uncertainty and a lot of change. I think that brings a huge amount of challenge to the sector. Regardless of where we go, I'd like to see the sector come together. I'd really think there's an opportunity for us to weather the storm if we're much more aligned in what we do. I mean, British Water, Water Industry Forum, UK Water Partnership, Future Water, ICE, SIOM, all of those organisations starting to see a much more collective, aligned effort. I think that would be good for all of us.
Well, that kind of brings me on to one of my key questions is what's your sort of call for action for the water industry in the UK?
I think with all the challenges that are coming, both the political challenges but also the challenges that climate change bring, I think the UK's got an awful lot to offer to the world. I think we need something that's much more fit for purpose in terms of us galvanising all our individual efforts into something more collective. I think there's space there for us to do it. I think there's an increasing willingness at the senior levels of some of those representative organisations, but I think we have a duty to do it, really. I think there's, in an uncertain future, our activities internationally are going to be, I think, we're going to be judged by how we reacted to some of these huge challenges. And I think we've got an awful lot to offer across the whole supply chain in Britain.
Okay, so Ofwat have got a disaggregation agenda. So they're trying to open up competition in the UK water market. Now, how do you see sort of regulation evolving in the UK industry?
I have my personal perspective. I've always thought you get more competition from a running race of maybe 5 rather than maybe 50. So there's an element of how much value is there still to be extracted for customers at a time when, if anything, I think the cost of water is very low. We don't really recognise the value of water, and I'd like to see a lot more incentive around maybe 80 litres of water being the where we target individuals per capita consumption, that the bill can reduce for people who use that much water, and when we use more water it becomes significantly more expensive. So what does that mean in terms of competition? Ultimately, I think it's better value to the customer but more sustainable in the way in which we use water. That's what we should be about. And if we do that in the right way and get that at scale, we may not require so many additional resources. And I think Ofwat have done quite a lot around that behavioural space on how we reduce demand, change the way in which we use water at a personal level. Interestingly, the water companies have a responsibility to the curtilage of the property, and a lot of what we're talking about is what happens within the building itself. So I think that behavioural space has got to become a space in which we all embrace how we can deliver innovation for everybody.
Now, one of Ofwat's areas in which they're trying to increase competition or bring in competition is the bioresources area. Have you got any thoughts on that?
It's about how much value is there in that space, and I'm sure we could, if we sat half a dozen experts, we'd probably get people who think it's really important and people think it's less important. I think in the big picture of things, if we're not careful, we can increase lots of smaller initiatives and lose sight of what we really want, which is maybe a lot more working together around common problems, the big problems, particularly with an aged and ageing asset base across this country, where we've got some really fundamental things we've got to address, like leakage in our asset health.
I've seen some companies, leading companies in the water industry, turning more to sort of AI and those sorts of technologies. Have you got any thoughts in terms of what you think we could be using those things for in the future?
Well, we're already looking at how we're using machine learning to look at natural flood management and how we can start to recognise different characteristics of catchments and land use. An interesting challenge that came at a recent international conference I was at, where the chief executive of Water Care in Auckland, he said, how many robots has each of the water companies got? And I think rather than answering the question, I thought it was a really great question to ask. And then, and if you've got some, what are you using them for? So there's an element that clearly there's value in using digital within the cloud for all our billing and greater consistency of things like that, for real time or real enough time to manage our operations so that we can get more efficiency optimization. But the interesting thing is, for me, we have so many of our assets that we know very little about. And also we concentrate an awful lot on our built assets, our grey infrastructure. We also have a lot of natural assets that are part of that water cycle, that in some ways I think there's been an element of us disconnecting our thinking and focusing a little bit more on metropolitan water than the whole water cycle. I think that's moving, and I think as we do that, we'll find that that understanding the assets we've got will deliver value. Using digital as an enabler will allow us to manage those more effectively, but we have to think collectively around these being natural and physical assets.
And I think part of the output of that is all this data that's now coming out from all the assets. And in a way, there's too much data. And what do you use? What data is necessarily needed?
So the term data lake gets used. If we're not careful, I think we'll drown in a data lake. So when I talk about the context of not just real-time data, but real enough data, is for certain things, maybe an hourly or a daily reading is enough for us to understand the issue that we're trying to optimise or address, rather than a continuous stream of real-time data that could just swamp us.
I think there's a perception with this sort of whole sort of nationalisation debate that water companies aren't being as effective as they can be at serving the public. But it's one of the cheapest provisions that there are around if you compare it to electricity and mobile phone bills, gas. And I don't think people actually appreciate and understand the value of water. So what do you think we can be doing with the water companies to work together collectively to help customers to understand what is the benefit of putting your tap on and then flushing your toilet and all that lovely stuff is dealt with without having to think about it?
I think if we took a step back, when public health was first introduced into this country and we solved things like cholera and typhoid, you'd find that the engineers, the sanitation engineers of their day, they were these great individuals, the Basel jets, this transformation. And I think that what's happened is we've sort of, as generations have passed, taken for granted the service that we get. And because it's not very visible, it's sort of out of our own. We haven't experienced a cholera outbreak or something like that. Interestingly, in New Zealand, where they have had some issues around water treatment, they've even resulted in fatalities. I think there's a much more of a an awareness to regulate this public health, and it's a really responsible thing to do. So in these, I think there is an element of us conveying the value of what we do, conveying the value of clean water in the context of maybe of our global UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, in the context of those countries where they don't have the privilege or the opportunity or that contribution to the economic vitality of the country. I think that's really quite important. But I mean, fundamentally, we have still disconnected what we do around water and sanitation away from the entire cycle. And I think children learn about the water cycle at school, and I think we should carry and build on that understanding, that system, and how that relates to the other systems, to get much more collective understanding of the value of what we're providing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things, isn't it, that water runs through every asset in terms of infrastructure.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a sort of full of people understanding water as a silo. It cuts across many different sectors.
It is, and from a climate change perspective, you know, over 90% of the impacts of climate change are felt through the water cycle. That's a phenomenal phenomenal thing to think that the system that we thought was quite static with a few fluctuations has now become a lot more dynamic. As that becomes more dynamic, railways flood, or you know, we have droughts and food production's affected. I think it's really significant, and our understanding of that cycle is the key to us making the most of how we can come up with more sustainable and resilient solutions going forward.
Now, in terms of the international markets, now we help companies to export and explore opportunities overseas. How do you think supply chain companies could best identify opportunities overseas? Because there are lots of projects that your company has done, sort of lots of flagship projects, not only in the water sector, and you've obviously got offices all over the world, but if you're an SME and you're trying to find the next sort of market opportunity, how do you think they should best go about exploring those areas?
I think it's a really good question. I think there's an element of we need to get a better collective picture of what we offer from the UK, and then offer that as a UK offering. Now, I see an Australian water partnership that does that. I see a Dutch water partnership, a German water partnership. I see the Canadians coming together. I see the Israelis coming together, the French, even the Swiss. But from a UK perspective, and I think all of those get funding, federal funding and support. From a UK perspective, I think it doesn't matter what it's called, but our organisations working together, putting that jigsaw together that creates the sort of the Union Jack that goes overseas in the right way. I think companies helping each other, some of the larger companies, if they understand what value is coming from some of the SMEs, forging stronger strategic relationships, and ensuring that we are present in all the right conferences. I'm on the organising committee for Singapore International Water Week, but there's nobody else from the UK involved in that organising committee. At Stockholm World Water Week, where policy is very much right at the forefront, there's a dearth of British participation. When we go to the World Water Congress in Tokyo, there were some players, but I think nowhere near enough. So I think if we can galvanise what we're doing within the UK, if we can recognise who's trying to develop business where, then we can forge much stronger relationships to go overseas. I think British Water have a really key role to play within that space, and I think have been very much leading the way in what we've been doing. But I think there's so much more that we can do if we get our act together.
Okay, so with everything that you've mentioned in terms of the need for collaboration, companies working together to best understand what the UK has to offer, where do you think sort of British Water fits in all of this? What can we do as an organisation to help?
So I think British Water's right at the forefront. I think it's championed what we can do, both from a UK, from a national perspective, from an international perspective, since it was founded, and Arup were a founding partner. I think it's gone through some change. I think it's taken a look at itself and refreshed itself. I think that's really quite exciting and invigorating. But it starts to create momentum. We want to take that momentum and collectively combine that with some of those other organisations so that we better serve the SMEs, the wider supply chain of the UK, with something that really is internationally powerful and competitive. And I think we can be competitive. We've got brilliant engineers, scientists, economists, planners, and British Water definitely for me is a catalyst helping to stimulate change and positive change.
Mark, thank you so much. It's been fascinating listening to you as our first thought leader on Talking on Water. Thank you.